Hi folks, it's Rob Lux here from Property Developer Network, coming to you live for another Sunday session. Now, last 2 weeks in a row, we've had a couple of technical challenges in trying to get this Facebook Live thing working by integrating it with Zoom. So hopefully we've got the bugs ironed out of that. I'm just, I guess, trying to share a couple of things in the background so I can actually share a presentation with you that I've been preparing for today. Now, today's session is all about the rental impacts on, the rental market impacts, I should say, from COVID-19. Now, we are a property development group. However, there's a number of people within our community that have got rental properties, and there's a lot of policies being released by the federal and state governments at this point in time. And we tend to encourage our guys that when they're creating property developments, that they actually keep their stock. And so they've actually got a lot of rental stock in the community. So I thought it was timely that we actually have a look at some of these policies that are actually coming through and give you guys a little bit of an insight as to what is either been released or about to be released and the impacts that that will have on you. Now, I've actually prepared this as a presentation, so I'm just going to quickly whip over and share screens here. So give me one moment and I will be with you. Here we go, folks. So Sunday session, rental market impacts from COVID-19. So firstly, let's have a look at, I guess, probably one of the biggest drivers that sits in around this market at the moment is our unemployment rate. Now, obviously, being with the number of people losing jobs, being locked up at home, we've had a significant increase in our unemployment rate recently. What we can see down the bottom here is the Australian Bureau of Statistics projected seasonally adjusted figures. Now, these figures were what they anticipated from our unemployment rate perspective. Whereas the line above it in this kind of grey-green kind of colour is some actual live statistics that have been taken by Roy Morgan Research. And you'll notice that in the very latest round, and we haven't got the rounds for this week at the moment, but they're capturing these week at a time, you see that it's actually shot up to, say, approximately 16.8% unemployment rate at this moment in time, which is a massive, massive number, okay? Especially when we were projecting to be in and around the 5.1% mark. Now, if we have a look at our historical unemployment rate, and I'll go back in time to have a look at some of these, so we can actually see some other impacts in the market to see what our unemployment rates may have been at that point in time. So if we go back in time to the early 1980s, there was a global recession on at that point in time. And I guess we can see there that we were just above the 10%, not quite 10.5% unemployment rate. If we have a look at the Australian recession that we had to have in the early 1990s, again, we're up around the 11% unemployment rate. And if we have a look at the GFC, we were down just over the 4% and a bit mark. So you can see that from a implications point of view, this COVID event, for want of a better word, has had a massive impact on our unemployment rate. Now, what that has meant is that a lot of people are actually struggling to be able to pay their rent. And they're also struggling to actually pay their mortgages. And so there's been a lot of impacts on that has rippled through the economy. Now, going back, I'm going to say a good 6 to 8 weeks ago, when these implications started to come out, we started to see a number of people starting to take actions by putting out petitions. Now, there are a number of petitions that went out there at the time. So we'll just go back in time and have a look at some of these as they went. So there was this one here called the COVID-19 rent strike. Now, this one didn't get a huge amount of momentum. It only got somewhere close to about 18,000 people signing that petition. So it didn't gain a lot of momentum for this petition. But what it did do is just raise awareness to people that then started brewing under the covers. This one here is a little bit more recent one. So this is actually landlords saying that they're looking for assistance in this process because, you know, renters are asking for help, but landlords are also asking for help. This one's only been released in the last couple of days and has climbed fairly quickly in a fairly short amount of time. But these two themselves haven't really created any noise with regards to the federal government. This one, however, I think this one's got over 520 different signatories to it. So it's asking for a range of things, which is basically a freeze of mortgages, rents, bills, and instead to actually offer a salary substitute. Now, when this started to get a lot of momentum at the time, if we go back in time at one of my previous presentations, I actually showed this particular slide, which was, well, what is the world doing when it comes to rental and mortgage assistance at that point in time? We can see across the board that a number of different countries were doing things very, very differently. But at that point in time, Australia was doing nothing at all. And what I projected at that point in time is that we would have a version of all three of those sitting across the board. So a moratorium on rental, on mortgage repayments, all evictions to be suspended, and some form of rent freeze was likely to come into play, was my projections at the time. So let's see how this presentation pans out and see whether or not my projections were actually correct. So with all of that noise happening, what did the federal government do? I guess there were a number of different releases, media releases that they came up with. So there was one specifically on the 27th of March, which was the initial media release, where basically Scott Morrison acknowledged the fact that there was a lot of impact to the community, that they heard our cries, and they were going to work on something as a matter of priority in order to help both renters and landlords across the board. And then there was a second media release that came out on the 7th of April, which was specifically to address landlord and renters in the business community. So in the commercial space, I should say. And it was actually called the SME Commercial Leasing Principles during COVID-19 policy, because that really rolls off the tip of the tongue. So the SME Commercial Leasing Principles during COVID-19. Now, a bit of a mouthful, but I'm going to walk you through some of the implications of that. And at the same time, they also inferenced the fact that there was also going to be some impacts in the residential world. So let's have a look at the commercial properties and what they were proposing. So that mandatory code of conduct came into effect on the 7th of April. So that was when it was actually released. It applies specifically to small and medium-sized business tenancies with an annual turnover of less than $50 million. And more importantly, they need to be eligible for the JobKeeper support package. So it needs to be the combination of those two. And that's where those commercial code of conducts then start to come into play. Now I'm going to go into what that code of conduct is pretty soon. But in the residential space, all they really released was there's going to be a 6-month moratorium on evictions. Now, both of them, when they were released, because the federal government doesn't actually have jurisdiction, what they said was, we're mandating that this is going to apply and we're pushing that down, but the states need to enforce this because the states are the relevant authorities who actually look after the separate residential tenancies acts and that sort of thing. And the federal government doesn't actually have jurisdiction in this department. And so as a result of that, federal government were issuing a mandate, but the state governments had to then go and apply it. Now, because of that, each state is going to actually be releasing that in a slightly different variation. And we're going to go through some of those variations as we go. So let's have a look at that slide that I issued earlier and see whether or not my projections actually came through on this. So moratorium on mortgage repayments, yes, that has come into effect and it's both in the commercial and residential space. And you'll notice that there's an asterisk there. The asterisk there is that you have to actually go and negotiate that with your individual bank. So it's not a mandate, it's the banks should, okay? So that, and it's not been mandated at all levels, both commercial and residential, but rather the federal government has said, look, go and have a chat with your bank. And most banks, if they are good corporate citizens, will actually come to the party. And I actually did a presentation on that just last week on how those banks have actually come to the party on that. Now, eviction suspended. Absolutely, they said a 6-month eviction suspension. So nobody is actually going to be kicked out because of COVID-19 financial hardships. And from a rent freeze perspective, well, that one's got a little bit of an asterisk. In the commercial space, that's been mandated via that policy. In the residential space, that's been taken up slightly differently in each of the different jurisdictions. There was no mandate from the federal government to do that. And so some states have done something and other states have not. So let's go through what some of these things are. Now, as I said before, it is only the code of conduct which applies to the corporate world that has actually been mandated. Everything else is by inference only, and they're pretty much following the mandate of the corporate world as their guiding principles, for want of a better word. So the objective of this code is to make sure that there's a proportionate and measured way of actually understanding the financial risk and cash flow implications during COVID-19, which means that if a business is impacted a small amount, then the rental implications of that should also be a small amount. If the business is impacted a large amount, then they're asking for the landlords to take that into consideration and appropriately apportion their discounts appropriately. So it's intended that all of the parties actually negotiate, and they need to take the tenant's particular circumstances into account. And that's the critical part to this, because some tenants, their business is able to keep trading and they're not really that financially impacted. As a matter of fact, there are some businesses that are actually booming at this point in time, whereas other businesses have been forced to shut down and other businesses have just had to slow down and potentially change how they actually operate. So every business has been impacted slightly differently. So the next part is to negotiate in good faith. Okay, so we're expected to negotiate in good faith. Now, there's no real defined terms as to what that negotiate in good faith actually represents, but I'll go through some of the inferences of that as we go. And we need to take into account the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the tenant with regards to their revenue, expenses, profitability, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we can't just wipe the slate clean, or if we want to give them a discount, we have to say, well, how badly impacted were you? And make sure that the implications that we give them or the discounts that we give them are proportionate to that. So let's have a look at the implications of that for the tenants. Okay, so the tenants will not be evicted. Okay, so during the pandemic or reasonable subsequent period, and this is a little bit conjectural, because what is a reasonable subsequent period afterwards? So during the pandemic, whilst the pandemic has not been declared as to how and when it's going to be finished, I think we can safely assume that the federal government is going to say, okay, pandemic over for Australia at some point in time, so we can officially have an end date for that. But then what is a reasonable subsequent period afterwards? And that hasn't been defined in any of these policies. So tenants will have the benefit of proportionate reductions in rent by way of waivers and deferrals of anywhere up to 100% of their rent. Okay, so the waiver must constitute a minimum of 50% of the total reduction in the rent period. So that is basically, yep, I'm just wiping your need to actually pay me back. Now, from a landlord perspective, clearly that has massive implications, because the landlord cannot receive that 50% rent irrespective at this point in time. Okay, so whatever discounts are being applied, a minimum of that must be in the way of just wiping the slate clean. Okay, so that's quite impactful if you're a landlord. So if the rent is deferred, so that is the balance of the 50%, and that's only up to, remember, so remember it was a minimum of 50%, so maybe you've had to wipe off some of it, wipe off all of it. Deferred rent must be amortized over the balance of the lease, or a period of no less than 24 months, whichever is the greater. So if the balance of the lease is 6 months, then the tenant can technically walk out at the end of 6 months, but you're going to amortize them for 24 months for them to be able to pay you back. Whether or not they have the capability of that, there's nothing being defined in that. You cannot charge any fees, interest, or other charges in respect to any of these waived rents. Okay, so anything that you've waived, remember, you've been forced to just give up that income. You can't charge any fees or interest or anything along those lines for that. Landlords also may not apply for any prohibition or levy penalties, which means that if, for example, the tenant has to reduce their hours or things like that, we can't actually say that we're going to force them to stay open. We can't mandate that. We must actually allow them to operate their business as they see fit during this period, remembering some people's businesses are just not getting the traffic. Other people's businesses just aren't allowed to trade because they've been mandated to close down. So the landlord can't apply any penalties with regards to what has actually happened from whether or not the tenant actually stays in business. The tenants also must comply with the lease terms with the exception of this discount. So whatever lease rules and conditions are in place, everything stays in place with the exception of this negotiated rent, okay? So what are the implications for the landlord? So it's pretty much the opposite of what was happening to the tenant. So the landlord must not terminate the lease due to non-payment. Okay, so there's a long set of guidelines that sit in around that, but it's pretty unclear whether or not you could terminate their lease for other reasons if, for example, they had other breaches. So if they happen to be behind in their rent and they happen to be doing other things that were a breach of your lease, you can't do anything from an eviction point of view with regards to non-payment of rent, but you may be able to do something with regards to the other breaches. That part is pretty unclear. If there's any reduction in any statutory charges, land tax, council rates, insurances, etc., these must be passed on to the tenant. It's compulsory that they are passed on, which means that A, you're giving away the tenant 50% of the rent, you're just waiving it. And if you happen to get the benefit of any discounts of land tax, etc., you must pass those on so that the tenant actually benefits from that. So it's quite prejudicially, that's not quite the word, but it's prejudicial to the actual landlord themselves. And so the tenant is very much in the box seat with regards to all of these things. The landlord must freeze any rent increases, okay, until the pandemic is over and they can actually return to a normal rent. And if the landlord gets any benefit at all from people like the finance institutions, so the banks and that sort of thing, then that must also be passed on in a proportionate way. So whatever discounts have been applied, whether they be through land tax or whether they be through rate reductions, insurance drops, or interest rate deferrals, etc., that needs to be passed on to the tenant so the landlord can't actually profit from it. So the landlord should also seek to waive any recover of any other expenses, okay? So the landlord can't go and seek any expenses for the recovery of lost income. The landlord equally cannot draw on any tenant's security for non-payment of rent. So typically a tenant would have a bond. They may also have a lien against their business or something along those lines. So the landlord can't draw on that in order to claim the rent. So that's been deemed not possible at this point in time. And the landlord must provide tenants with the opportunity to extend the lease and extend the lease for the equivalent period of time that the rent waiver or deferral had actually be applied. So if you give them a 6-month deferral of their rent or a 6-month waiver of their rent, it's mandatory that you must extend their lease by the same 6 months, which means that if you were looking at renewing your tenant with some and replace them with another one, you're now locked into that tenant for a little bit longer. So can actually be quite prejudicial if you are the landlord. So some of the known challenges, I've already highlighted some of them, but let's go through them just to be clear. There is no certainty around key terms such as what is the COVID-19 pandemic period. So there's no defined end date to that. And there's also no defined definition around what is a reasonable subsequent recovery period. It is deemed that the individual states will actually come up with a definition that sits in and around those. And let's see whether or not the states do that as we get through to that period. It's also unclear how any mediation process or penalties for non-compliance might operate. None of that has actually been defined within the policy. And any agreements or incentives and that sort of thing, whether they regard to operational incentives and that sort of thing, it doesn't deem how they're actually going to deal with those, okay? It doesn't deal with whether or not the lease actually expires prior to, I guess, during the COVID period or anything like that. So what happens, you know, they've said you can amortize your deferred rent or your waived rent over 24 months. Well, what happens if the lease expires during that period? Nothing is there as to whether or not you can still continue to claim after that period. And it's not clear whether or not interest can be charged on the deferred rent. So you can't profit from it, but you may be able to pass on interest, but the wording is not really clear. It implies that you can, so long as it is not punitive, and punitive means that it's there to punish. Okay, so if, for example, you got charged a 5% interest rate by your bank, it would infer that you could pass that 5% all the way through, but you couldn't pass it through at, say, 10%, for example. And it's not clear on whether or not the landlord prohibits actions for termination of rent arrears type situation. So it's not really clear. It infers that you can, but it's not absolutely mandatory that or not absolutely clear that that's going to occur. So what's going to come next? As I said, this is just the commercial space that this policy has actually been defined for at the federal level. And what has happened is the states have taken that federal policy on the commercial, and they've also started to infer that into the residential space. So what's going to come next? I guess these codes and policies need to be given effect, is the legal definition, given effect at each state individually. So each state needs to write up the appropriate legislation, get that passed, get that reviewed and passed. And so that is taking some time to actually get through the works. I'm going to go through what some of those proposed ones are right now, because as of this point in time, none of them have actually gone live. But there's a number of them that are actually going to go live this week, hence the timeliness of this presentation. So although no timing's been provided, every state is going to pass this legislation as quickly as humanly possible. And as I said, there's some of them going to release that this week. So you, the individual, should be monitoring the implementation of your particular code in your relevant state or territory, because how New South Wales applies it and how Queensland applies it and how Victoria applies it, etc., may be completely different in every single jurisdiction. And I'm going to go through some of those differences in a sec. Make sure you stay connected to this PDN community, and we'll be giving you updates as we notice them come live. But what I'm going to show you in the following slides is what we have spotted so far. Now note, I've put quite a bit of effort in trying to research this Australia-wide, but at this point in time, it's only 3 states that have actually given us very clear, definitive responses as to what is actually happening. Everything else at the moment is still very much in the planning stage, and there's not much visibility of it. So let's go through those 3 states. So Queensland, what has the Queensland government response been? Well, on the 14th of April, the Queensland government announced that it would be introducing an emergency legislation into Parliament to go live on the 22nd of April. Now, noting that is only 3 days away, with $400 million to help renters and landlords deal with the economic fallout of COVID-19. That was the media release. Dealt with this in 4 basic areas. So leasing principles that came through on the mandatory policy, they've actually tried to apply them in both the commercial and residential sense, and given a variation of those leasing principles that are going to apply specifically for Queensland. There's a 6-month ban on evictions, rent relief for tenants. There's specific rent relief packages, and there's also some land tax relief packages that make up that 400 million. So let's break this down and see how that actually sits. So let's have a look. The rent relief for the residential people. So this was deemed that $500 a week for up to 4 weeks and $2,000 maximum available for Queenslanders who are homeless or at imminent risk of becoming homeless. So it's not whether or not you've lost an income, it's whether or not you are at risk of becoming homeless. Now, there's the question mark, because if you have been mandated that you can't be evicted, there's no risk of becoming homeless. So I think that's very much a weakness in the Queensland policy, and they haven't really thought that one through, okay? So in order to do this, you need to be renting a property currently, or you're soon going to be moving into a property, which means that anyone taking up a new lease is going to also be benefiting from these new policies coming through. You've lost your job and you must have applied for Centrelink in order to apply for this. Now, noting some people don't qualify for Centrelink because the assets test, for example, may not apply. So you may be very, very short on your income, but if you've got assets, you may not qualify for Centrelink. So there's going to be a lot of people that are actually left stranded in that regard. And I guess whilst you're waiting for the application for Centrelink, you can actually put the application in, but you need to have evidence negotiating a payment approach with your lessor or landlord. So you need to approach your lessor and landlord and say, hey, I'm in financial difficulty. Let's have some a bit of dialogue to try and negotiate fair and equitable terms and what you're going to be able to provide me in order to help me through. Okay. So that's the Queensland approach to this. From a land tax perspective, okay, what they've said is that land tax would apply. So a land tax rebate, i.e. discount, of up to 25% for eligible properties only within the 2019 and 2020 assessment year, which effectively means that it's only the 3 months between now and the end of financial year that a landlord can actually potentially qualify for this. So it's a very, very short, finite period that you may be able to get this land tax assessment. If you happen to be a foreign owner, then they would waive the 2% land tax foreign surcharge. And for any balance of payment, there would be a 3-month deferral of the land tax for the 2020-21 assessment year. So there's going to be a deferral of that payment. Now, in order to qualify for this is where it gets interesting. So a landowner must comply with all of the following. Okay, the ability of one or more of the tenants to pay the normal rent is affected by the pandemic. You will provide rent relief to the affected tenants. So you must provide rent relief, whether you want to or not, at the amount at least commensurate with the land tax rebate. So whatever the land tax rebate is, so that 25%, you must pass on to the tenant. And you must comply with the leasing principles, even if you don't have a current lease in place. So maybe their lease has expired, they might be on a month to month. Well, you must go into and comply with the new Queensland government leasing principles, which are not identical to the federal government leasing principles. And if you're a landowner, I guess there's an alternative way. So your property must be available for lease, either all or part of it. So either it's tenanted right now or at least available for lease. So you can't just say, hey, I'd like a discount, even if you haven't got it out on the rental market right now. So you need to demonstrate that you have been on the rental market. And your ability to secure tenants has been affected. So you've been advertising and marketing, but nobody can actually come through, or nobody has come through. You require relief from your financial obligations. So you'll need some form of letter from your bank saying, hey, I'm struggling with the rental payments, and you've actually applied for that discount there. And again, the leasing principles would be in force if you actually went to, if you actually had a tenant finally sign up. So these are the relief leasing principles that the Queensland government put in. So they had an initial response that said it was going to deal with landlords and tenants. Now, when you actually read it, it didn't actually deal with landlords at all, and it was 100% tenant-centric. And the benefits were 100% in favour of the tenant, and the landlord was basically stripped of all of their rights as to how and what they could actually do in order to protect themselves. Now, that created an uproar within the Queensland industry to the point where the Real Estate Institute of Queensland actually started a campaign and started to lobby government. So some of the things that they said in there is that your tenants will never have to pay you back, which was not really fair or appropriate. You can't ask your tenant for any proof of financial hardship, meaning that the person could just claim hardship and you had no ability to actually determine whether that was factual or otherwise. So if they just wanted to keep money in their pocket, they could easily defraud you. Your landlord insurance would not cover you for any rental arrears, which was critical, because if you have landlord's insurance, you need to make sure that that is actually covering you. And I'm going to go over that a little bit later on as to insurance implications on some of this. Your tenancy agreement will automatically immediately be extended by at least 6 months, meaning that there's no ability for you to, if you were thinking of moving back into the property or thinking of selling the property or things like that, now you're forced to keep that tenant for an extra 6 months, whether you wanted to or not. The tenant could refuse entry at all, even for everything other than emergency repairs. So you couldn't do inspections, you couldn't put the property for sale, you couldn't do anything like that. So they could absolutely refuse you entry. And the tenant could break lease with only 7 days notice. So it was 100% tenant centric, which meant that the poor landlord had all of their rights actually waived. Now, when the REIQ launched this, they were quite strategic and went out to all of the property managers out there, all of the industry experts, who then propagated a letter into the minister's office, the Premier's office, I should say. And as a result of that, they got hundreds of thousands of identical emails going, "You're not looking after my rights, you're not looking after my rights, you're not looking after my rights." So as of yesterday, the REIQ put this media release out saying, actually, the Queensland government has now approached us and went, "Yeah, maybe you're right. Can we negotiate with you as to what we believe is a fairer way of actually dealing with this for both tenants and property owners?" And so what you see on the screen here is that mediated outcome that the REIQ has proposed. So rent payments and unpaid rent, well, property owners and tenants can now agree on terms, so they can negotiate on how that's going to go, rather than just a blanket waiving of them. Financial hardship requirements, well, now the person has to actually prove the financial hardship and that they have to have demonstrated that they've reduced by more than 25% their income, or alternatively, the rent actually exceeds 30% of their income, whichever of those two may actually apply. So you need to substantiate that financial hardships. Entry requirements, you can still have entry requirements, but the government needs to provide very clear guidance on what is and isn't appropriate. So if you want to list the property for sale, what is allowed? If you want to do your property inspections on a regular basis and make sure that the property is being looked after, what is allowed? So those need to be mandated. Any break lease, I guess to do this under a hardship arrangement, you need to be able to define what that hardship is. So that's a 75% reduction in the combined tenant's income. And in addition, they must have less than $5,000 in savings in the bank. And any extension of tenancy, a fixed term tenancy, will be automatically extended until 30th September unless otherwise agreed. So that was that bottom dot point is pretty much the only one out of the original policy that was actually implemented. Everything else was lobbied for and won by the REIQ. So let's see whether or not New South Wales has actually dealt with this better than Queensland government did. So New South Wales, on the 13th of April, they announced they were going to commit $440 million into their relief packages, and the money would go towards helping households that have lost at least 25% of their rental income. Okay, so they were quite clear on that that monetary amount right up front, and they were breaking this down into 3 basic elements: so 60-day moratorium, rent relief for tenants, and land tax. So you see pretty similar themes across those two, but they've approached it in a different way. Now, whether they saw the pain that Queensland went through, because Queensland came out very fast out of the gates, and whether they modified it up front, or whether they were just better at planning it up right from the start, who's to know? So the rent relief, renters, I guess, whose ability to pay rent has been impacted by the coronavirus, will be protected by an immediate 60-day ban on evictions. Now, immediate 60-day and then a potential to extend that further on, but I'll come to that in a sec. Landlords will be required to negotiate rent in good faith. You can see here that they've dealt with that much better than Queensland did. So go and negotiate that right up front. And if an agreement can't be reached, then there's actually a process to go to NCAT in order to deal with that. And NCAT will actually make a determination of that after the 60-day period. Remember, they can't get kicked out for 60 days, and I'm anticipating NCAT is going to be inundated with these, and so they want time to actually prepare for that. So NCAT will decide whether or not the eviction will go ahead, and whether or not the renters have the ability to pay back the amount or not will be subject to negotiation between the tenant and the landlord, okay? So the back rent will not automatically be waived, which means that there is an ability to have a claim against that, which means that you may be able to claim that against bond or anything like that at the tail end when the tenant actually eventually leaves. Now, there is also a rent relief. So from a tenant's perspective, okay, the household must be impacted by this, okay? So one or more members of the household need to have stood down, and they must be impacted by 25% or more in order to from their rental. And in addition to that, they also need to be qualified for the job keeper payment policy. So it's I guess an and situation, not an or situation. So the rent relief by that mutual agreement, there's a couple of different ways that can actually be done. You can determine whether or not the rent will actually be waived or reduced. You can determine what the new rent amount payable will be. You can determine the date of agreement to be reviewed. So you can say in 3 months, 6 months, when are we actually going to come back to that? And you can also negotiate any repayment plan. So that's between fair and reasonable people, being the tenant and the landlord, coming together under fair and reasonable grounds, which I think is nothing but a good thing. So in order to provide evidence, the tenant must provide evidence that they actually are under the financial hardship. So they have to prove that their job has actually been terminated, stood down, or they've lost working hours. They need to prove that they've got government income support, and they have to have proof of their prior income. So it's not just a matter of saying, hey, I'm poor, but you need to say, hey, I was actually on something prior to this much, much better. I think that evidence is actually a fantastic way of actually dealing with that. So land tax relief, so this is for the landlords. So again, the landlords are only eligible for up to 25%, and they only qualify if they pass those savings on to the tenants. Okay, so any discount gets applied to the tenant. And in order to do that, it's only within the calendar year. So whereas Queensland said it was within the financial year, New South Wales have said it's within the calendar year, which means that it's much longer qualifying period, which means that not just the pandemic period, but also the subsequent recovery period can also be taken into account. So I think New South Wales have done that much, much better than Queensland. Any balance remaining after that discount will then have a further 3 months deferral period. So it's a 25% discount plus a deferral of the remaining 75%, which is fantastic. And in order to do that, you need to actually demonstrate that the tenant was actually making payments, and that those payments have actually been reduced by 25% or so due to the COVID-19. Now, what New South Wales have also done very, very well is, in order to deal with the potential for evictions, they've actually built a really nice flowchart which determines if you want to evict somebody, under what terms you're actually going to do that. And they've been very clear in how they've done that. Now, I think that how well they've done that, you could equally just copy and paste that into almost every other state and apply that very easily. And I would encourage any other states to do that. And even if you are in another state, you should probably use the logic that's sitting behind this as a fair litmus test as to whether or not what you're doing is actually appropriate if you're wanting to evict your tenants. Victoria government, what are they doing? Well, they're doing it a slight variation, but let's see, 15th of April, they've announced that they'd be introducing emergency legislation to go into Parliament on the 23rd of April. So that's not far away, only 4 days away, with 500 million to go towards the rent relief and also the landlord relief. So this is 4 basic elements: 6-month ban on evictions, a pause on rental increases for 6 months, again, rent relief, and again, land tax relief. So if we look at the rent relief, there's 80 million fund set up very specifically for this. And again, a maximum of $2,000 for any tenant to actually claim that. The grant is paid directly to the tenant's agent, lessor, or landlord. So the tenant doesn't actually receive cash. It actually goes directly to the landlord or also the rental agency actually looking after the property manager. So the rent relief eligibility, okay, you need to demonstrate your hardship and that you need to demonstrate that your 30% of your income, more than 30% of your income is going towards rent, and that you've registered your new rental agreement with the Consumer Affairs Victoria. So the revised agreement, so that negotiated agreement with your landlord, you need to register that. And you need to also prove that you've got less than $5,000 of savings in the bank. And you also need to demonstrate that you've got less than $1,903 per week of household income. So it's not you, the individual, but it's the household. Those people can then qualify for up to $2,000 worth of rent relief. It doesn't say how that's broken up, how long that's broken over. For example, Queensland said that it was going to be $500 each week for 4 weeks, whereas Victoria hasn't defined where that's going. What they have also said, though, is whether you're an Australian citizen or not, everybody qualifies for this, whether you're on a working visa, skilled visa, if you're a seasonal worker, New Zealand citizen, refugee, or anybody. If you are paying a lease right now and you are impacted, then you qualify. And I think that is a fantastic statement to support the community, irrespective of their nationality, irrespective of how they're actually coming to live here. They are now currently a member of our society, so they should be afforded all of the rights of everybody else. So well done, Victoria, for actually doing that. Land tax relief. Landlords need to provide proof that the tenants were actually impacted. And again, they will get a 25% reduction in their land tax. It's available whether or not, it's also available if you are unable to secure a tenant, I should say. So if you have it on the market, but you are unable to secure a tenant, and the balance of the land tax being the 75% can also be deferred for 3 months as well. Okay, so that's fantastic. Very similar to New South Wales and how they've actually done that. So land tax eligibility. So you need to have all or part of the property is rented. The ability for at least one tenant to prove that their rent has been impacted. Their income has been impacted, and that you can provide that you have also provided that rent relief in accordance with the scheme. So the discount you get must be provided back to the tenant. Okay, so it's not that you're getting a cash incentive, you're actually passing that back to the tenant. And again, this is available for both residential and commercial properties. However, in order to qualify as a commercial property, you need to be able to qualify under the federal government's mandatory policy, which is that you're a small business, that you have the job, that you qualify for the job keeper payment, being that you're less than 50,000 and that you've lost income in your business. So a couple of things that have been impacted there. Now, so far, only those 3 states have I found evidence of these policies being published. All the other states are definitely working on their policies, but I am anticipating they're going to be very similar in nature to all of these, with some slight variations in and around that. So I would encourage you very much to be looking at your local jurisdiction to see what is proposed before it actually goes into legislation, just in case it has to be something like Queensland, where you need to lobby because it's not fair or equitable to all parties. Now, here's the catch. The challenge with all of this, as far as I'm concerned, is that all of this is mandating from federal government down to state government that you must attempt to renegotiate your lease with your tenant. But there's a catch. What happens if you have landlord's insurance covered? So if you've got landlord's insurance to cover loss of rent, typically you're going to have these 4 areas inside your insurance policy. So legal expenses for tenant disputes, missed rental payments, lease breaks, loss of rent if property is uninhabitable. But I think that missed rental payments and lease breaks start to become very, very questionable as to whether or not your landlord's insurance policy will now actually start to apply. And the reason why I say that is that you've been mandated to renegotiate, whereas almost every single one of these policies says that you can't renegotiate. And so this is where it starts to get really challenging. And equally, you can't evict. So the lease break situation becomes really challenging as well. So let's try and look at this in a little bit more detail, shall we? Firstly, who is still offering landlords insurance? Now, there's a lot more suppliers out there, but just a little bit of an around the grounds on these guys. And right this very moment, who is still actually offering landlords insurance? If you went to actually buy landlords insurance today for a brand new policy, there's only a couple of them out there still offering new policies at this very moment in time. They've all been hurt, and they've all been hurt quite hard. So they've locked the door right this very second to say, we're not going to let anybody in, with the exception of Amy and Yui at this point in time. Now, there's probably a couple of smaller ones out there. I haven't polled all of the suppliers out there, but certainly from what I can see here. Now, of all of these, who is actually holding tenant default options? None of them. So even with those new policies, no longer can you actually get those tenant defaults or income protection elements inside those policies. So even if you took up a brand new policy with Amy or Yui right now, you wouldn't get rental protection or tenant default protection on either of those. So very challenging times if you're trying to take up a policy right now. But what happens if you already have a policy in place? Well, I went and tried to have a look at a couple of random policies out there just to see how each company is actually dealing with this. And rather than pick on an individual company, what I've tried to do is anonymize the frequently asked questions that I saw that were fairly common themes across a number of the suppliers. Now, it's not identical in all of them, so let me be clear here. So frequently asked question on their website: what occurs if following unemployment due to COVID-19, a tenant wants to break the lease? So the answer was coverage may be available under the rent default section based on hardship, but the normal rules of termination would apply. Here's the challenge. Normal rules of termination, well, if they're having hardship, the federal and state governments have now mandated what those break lease arrangements are going to be. So it could be that either the state government's rules on breaking lease actually override the policy that you've actually got in place. So be very careful in and around that one. Next frequently asked question: can rent default be claimed if the tenant is unable to pay rent? Well, yes, this is claimable under the rent default section of the policy. Please refer to the landlord's PDS. The challenge here is that, well, in some states, they don't actually have to demonstrate their financial hardship in order to claim it. So in order to claim it on the insurance policy, how do you go about doing that? And whether or not that actually applies. Do you need to determine that they have actually got that financial hardship? Can a shortfall be claimed if you and the tenant mutually agree to reduce the weekly rent repayments? The answer is no. The difference in weekly rent is not claimable, as this is a mutual agreement between you and the tenant. Problem, big red light here, because you are being mandated to negotiate. Now, you're also being mandated to do that in a fair and equitable way. So what is fair and equitable? Is it fair and equitable that you protect your income protection and say, no, I'm not going to give a discount? Or is it fair and equitable that you must pass on a discount to your tenant because they've been impacted by a minimum 20%, 25% or 30%, depending upon which jurisdiction they're actually in. You're kind of in a rock and a hard place here, depending upon which jurisdiction that you're actually sitting in. And especially if you want to claim things like your land tax, well, you must pass that discount on to your tenant. Well, now you can't claim any loss of rent because of that. So there's a whole bunch of really messy stuff that sits in and around this. Next question, frequently asked question, can rent default be claimed if you and your tenant mutually agree upon a suspension of their rental payment? Again, no, as this is a mutual agreement. Well, the challenge is, again, the state government has said, well, you need to be negotiating this stuff and you need to do this by mutual agreement. So again, you're in a real rock and a hard place. So where does that sit? Last frequently asked question, what occurs if following unemployment due to COVID-19, a tenant wants to break lease due to financial hardship? Again, coverage may be available under the rent default based on hardship, but the normal rules of termination apply. So what are the normal rules? Remember, state government has now dictated whether or not they can actually break lease. And so, and whether or not that's actually under financial hardship and what those terms may actually be. So it may be that the state government is actually giving you a policy which does not allow you to claim your rental insurance. So with that in mind, now I'm going to declare this particular table. I didn't do the research personally on this. However, I found finder.com.au did do this homework. So I'm going to give all due credit to these guys. So this is an assessment of a number of insurance providers. They've actually looked at the PDS and then physically given that insurance provider a phone call and said, hey, in this particular circumstance, what would actually apply? So for CGU, what the PDS says is the rent will cover rent default if your tenant stops paying rent owed to you or your agent. Now, when they actually called this, the supplier, so IAG, who are CGU's parent company, have confirmed that you do not need to terminate the lease. That's fantastic because you're not allowed to terminate the lease. Or serve an eviction notice. So that's fantastic. Instead, they will only need to supply proof of financial loss. Well, what happens if you're in a state where you aren't allowed to ask for proof of financial loss? So it's kind of challenging there. So in this instance, they said you should be able to make a claim. And again, emphasis on should. Okay. Coles Insurance. Okay. A breach notice for non-payment of rent or notice of termination for non-payment of rent must be issued as soon as practicable when the rent is in arrears. Well, problem is that you can't actually issue a notice of termination. So when they were called, you have to submit a notice of termination before you can claim. However, a Coles representative suggested the claims would be considered if the landlord could prove lost income. So clearly Coles here are at least for that particular operator who answered that particular phone call, have said, look, we're going to be fair and reasonable in this instance because you're being mandated. So what they've said is you may be able to make a claim, but whether or not the next operator says the same thing, hard to know. So be very, very careful if that's your insurance provider. NRMA, their PDS says rent default is when your tenant stops paying rent or leaves without giving you notice. So IAG, again, so IAG own a couple of insurance companies. So IAG own NRMA. So landlords don't need to terminate. So very similar to the CGU instance. And again, you should be able to make a claim. If we have a look at Westpac, so Westpac says you're covered for loss of rent if your tenant leaves your building before the end of the rental period and does not give you required notice. Well, what if they do give you notice? Well, now it's challenging because the state government said in some instances 7 days notice. They can actually just up and leave with 7 days notice. Now you technically don't qualify. How does that sit? So Westpac representative has confirmed that the tenant would have to leave your property before you can make a claim. Unless they have left your property, it is unlikely you'll be able to make a claim. So as you can't evict, if they don't leave or if they don't give you notice to leave, if that's your policy, you might be really stuck. I guess at this point in time, questionable as to whether or not you'll actually get any insurance back. So UE, they've said a rental default is where your lessee occupies the premises without paying the rent, which leads to termination of the lease. Remember, you can't terminate the lease. So you must terminate the lease before you can claim, or your landlord policy, as evictions are currently banned, this isn't possible. So therefore, it is unlikely that you can make a claim. Now, having said that, again, the operator who actually answered said that, that at this point in time, they're considering the unprecedented situation and they're trying to find solutions. So you may be able to make a claim, but not by the technicality of what the PDS says. So it's really at their discretion. So hairy times, folks. If you happen to be a landlord at this point in time, then your rights have effectively been eroded across the board and your income has been reduced massively. You've got some saving grace in that you can actually go and apply to your bank for a rent moratorium. Sorry, not a rent moratorium, a mortgage moratorium, which will defer your repayments. Having said that, your interest is still accumulating, so your debt is actually growing, and you would then amortize that across the length of your loan, or instead capitalize that to the end of your loan. So the landlord is actually out of pocket here. It's the tenant who is actually benefiting. So I don't think that any of the federal push or the state's implementation of any of this has really taken a fair and appropriate view of the landlord's protection, okay? And even if you had the foresight of putting tenant protection insurance policies in place, even then it's questionable as to whether or not you actually are able to make a claim. And so unfortunately here, I think the landlord is a little bit out high and dry. So that's my around the grounds at the moment for the rental market. Now, if I'm going to be making a prediction for the next few weeks, and remember, I don't hold a financial services license. This is not financial advice. It's not investment advice or anything like that. This is really my point of view as to what I'm basing my decisions on. And whether or not you take that advice on board, I would highly encourage that you go seek your relevant professional to see whether or not they have similar guidance, or at least go and ask them the questions that I'm proposing to you. But please, please, please go seek that advice. So my crystal ball, okay? I'm looking at the stock market. The stock market has crashed and has had a recovery. I'm actually starting to see that stabilize now. Quite often, you'll actually see a crash, an attempted recovery, and then a secondary crash. That quite often happens, but I've seen the stabilization of that. It's hard to see whether or not that is a new COVID norm or whether or not that's them bracing themselves for the second drop. I'm liking to think that it's the new COVID norm, but time will tell whether that is actually the case. The reason why I think that is because we're at the end of, I guess we've flattened our curve and at the tail end of it. And when I look around the world, I'm starting to see most countries have actually flattened their curve. There's a couple of notable exceptions to that. And so I think the market is starting to factor in the fact that we're starting to come back to potential normality in the near future, or what will be the new normality. The property market. Well, the property market has got low activity at the moment. I think we're going to maintain that low market activity for quite some time. There's less people putting properties up for sale. There's less people actually buying properties at the moment. Right now, pricing has not been impacted. So I'm predicting in at least the short term, pricing will be maintained and there'll be the occasional bargain sale that come up. So it won't be, I guess, a mass rush on discount properties, but from, if you're an astute buyer, I think there's going to be the occasional bargain out there just to keep an eye on, as some people just kind of cash in their current position just in order to protect their downside. So watch out for the occasional bargain. I think there is potential for the market to drop in 2 to 6 months' time once the current relief packages that we've just discussed here start to run out. So once the pandemic, once we've been released, and then a fair and reasonable recovery period, at that point in time, all the protective mechanisms start to fall away. The rental incentives start to disappear. The land tax incentives start to disappear. The mortgage moratorium start to disappear. That's the point where people are actually going to be in a position where they actually determine what their genuine hardship is going to be. And I'm predicting at that point in time, we're going to see a potential market drop then. Now, how big is that drop? I really don't know. Whether or not there's other incentives that the government are going to release, I really don't know. But that's kind of my read on the market at this moment in time. I think also in 4 weeks' time, we're going to start to be let out very slowly. Now, are we going to be let out at week 4? No, but in 4 weeks' time, we'll know, I guess, the process that we'll be getting released under. Now, in order to do that, federal government has mandated that there's going to be 3 principles that they're going to be putting in place before they actually announce what that will be. So they want more extensive testing. So the ability to test anyone that is even slightly got a cough or a tickle in their throat. They want the ability to have the tracing capability for any infected people. So that is the tracing app that they're actually discussing out there. Now, civil libertarians out there, I can see jumping up and down about this tracing app. And from what I've seen about the discussions as to how that tracing app is going to work, and remember, I've got a 20 years of IT background in the background. They are not talking about it reporting back to a central database. What they're talking about is just your phone keeping track of what other phones came in close proximity. So nobody else knows other than your phone who you were close to. And then if you get infected, you press a button on your phone and it sends an alert out to those people. So if that's how it's implemented, that's certainly how it's proposed right now. I don't see any civil liberty challenges with that. I guess time will tell if that's actually what is released, but at least for the moment, that's what they're proposing. So me, for one, I will be installing the app. I have no issues at all. I think it's for the greater good of society. And any implications on me, I'm not really overly concerned. But I anticipate some of you will be. But so long as we've got a critical mass of people actually utilising it, I think it would be fair and appropriate to say, well, if one person's impacted, a lot of people around them then start to get to know that they were, and so we can lock down that very quickly. And the third thing is that local response capability. So if there is a hotspot in one particular local jurisdiction, the ability to lock down just that one hotspot. So not lock down the entire state, not lock down the entire country, but maybe just lock down that one little community. It might be an entire suburb. It might be one aged care facility. It might be one townhouse community, something along those lines. Just lock down that one little area to say, we can see a hotspot there. Let's lock it down as tight as we can, but just keep it contained as much as humanly possible. If they can implement those 3 policies, those 3 principles, then I see us starting to get released very, very slowly and quickly. Now, the release will be in stages, okay? So reversal of the original lockdown process is likely to occur. And there's another dot point there. There's a risk profile for occupations. I actually had that in one of my other presentations, and I left that dot point in here. But in the US, they actually did a occupational risk assessment as to their exposure levels, and teachers and lawyers and doctors and all of that sort of thing. And they broke it down into a whole bunch of categories as to what they thought their exposure level was, and equally how large that size of the community was with regards to contribution into society. And so I anticipate that the government will be looking at things like that to say, okay, for these particular job roles, there's a low impact. They're going to be a high number of people going back into the workforce. Let's release them. But maybe another section of the community, they might go, actually, that's a very high risk category. Maybe we won't release those. So there's a number of those that I think those decisions still need to come out and play out in the next couple of weeks. So other than that, folks, I hope you enjoyed that. Take the opportunity to let you know that we actually have virtual meetups. So we used to run physical meetups in the real world in Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne every single month. We are now running these as virtual meetups using Zoom technology to actually get out there. So if you are interested in doing that, I'll put a link down to how to do that in the links below. But every single one of these, I always do a market update. So you'll actually see what's actually happening in and around the market. A little bit like what we did today, where I drilled into one particular area, but it's a little bit more of a generic breakdown of what's happening in and around that property market. We also have industry experts every single month talking about issues and challenges within their particular area of expertise. And we also have somebody within our community sharing a real deal. So you get to see the good, the bad, and the ugly of how a project actually runs. And you can see not just the glory of people making money, but also the bumps and the hurdles and the obstacles and what do they need to solve in order to get there, including their real world numbers. So when you're starting to look at your property deals, you can actually look back at the history of all those real deals and go, okay, I'm trying to do this kind of specific strategy. Let's have a look at all those real deals that sit in that strategy category and see what are some of the issues and challenges I need to be aware of. And then we also have a masterminding session to actually help you on your property journey. So if you're interested in that, I'll put a link in the comments below. And at this point, I'm going to go and see whether or not the technology has been working and whether or not I've actually got some questions that have been coming through. If you're interested at all in getting involved in our community, reach out to us on any of those ones below. And what I'm going to try and do now is see whether or not my live actually went live and whether or not I can see any questions from you guys. Give me 2 secs while I try and navigate my way through that. Okay, I can see a ton of questions here. For once, it's actually worked. So number of people saying hi. So I'll just say a generic hi to everybody. I'm not going to name everybody individually. Rachel's got a question. I want the market to crash again so we can buy stocks when they're at their lowest. It's very frustrating thinking it's now actually stabilizing. Be careful what you wish for, Rachel. As I said before, it's hard to tell whether or not the market is actually in recovery or whether or not it's actually testing to see if a recovery might work before it drops again. In many other previous incidents, such as this, so GFCs and recessions and that sort of thing, it's crashed, attempted recovery and then crashed again, sometimes several times over. So be very careful what you wish for. That may actually occur. Rachel says, not only that, but my insurer, St. George/Westpac, said that if I want to terminate the landlord insurance element of my policy, just keep building, I may not be able to reinstate landlord insurance ever. That's a good point. If you actually have the coverage right now, make sure you keep the coverage. Really, really important. Now, let's see if I can see other comments in there. This is fun times in trying to actually navigate this through, to be honest. Because the comments go into 2 separate groups, which is always fun. I have to look everywhere to try and see this. Nope. I can see that there are 23 comments, but I cannot actually read what all of them are. Not sure why that's the case. I only can see 4 or 5 of them. So humble apologies, folks, if you actually have a question. Let me just see if I can navigate through to how that's actually occurred. No, that's not playing nicely. Once again, engaging with these comments has been very challenging with Zoom into Facebook Live, but that's the only way I can actually do the PowerPoint presentation. So my humble apologies on that one, folks. Anyway, either way, hope you guys actually enjoyed it. You've actually got the link in there as to how to join our virtual meetups. I can see that's in there already. Thank you very much, folks. I hope you got plenty out of that, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at my next Sunday session or at our next virtual meetup. And please, 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 if you've enjoyed this on our Facebook page, come and join our Facebook community. We would love to see you in there and participate moving forward. Okay, folks, bye for now.